Good morning and welcome to Miller Thomson's Health Industry Seminar Series Coffee Talk. I'm Karima Kanani, a partner in our health industry group, and I'm delighted to be joining you today to talk about regional integration and the lead agency. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. You are able to submit questions now while the session is in play. You will see a chat box on your screen. You don't have to wait until the end of the session. So by all means, as we progress through the presentation, submit whatever questions that you have. There will be some time allotted to Q&A at the end of the session, and I will do my best to get through as many of the questions as I can. If we're not able to cover all questions within the time that has been provided, we will certainly reach out to you and ensure that your questions have been addressed. So we have a lot of material to cover today. I'm going to dive right into our agenda for this morning on regional integration and the lead agency, a legal perspective. There are 4 topics that I want to cover in today's discussion on regional integration. I'd like to take a few minutes together to look at the integration spectrum. What is it that we actually mean when we use the phrase integration that has become somewhat of a term of art in our industry? Next, we'll take a few minutes and just recap for ourselves who are the key stakeholders in integration initiatives and what roles do they play in these initiatives. The large bulk of our discussion today will then focus more particularly on the lead agency and the role of the lead agency in integration, most often in the area of service integration. And we'll look at some different models for lead agencies. And last, but certainly not least, and importantly for all of you, we'll discuss what are some implementation risk management measures that can be adopted certainly by lead agencies, but also that participants in regional initiatives should be mindful of as you move forward with these projects. So what is integration? We've all certainly been using that phrase for quite some time, and it's good to take ourselves back to the basics of this phrase because it is quite a broad and very loaded term in terms of the scope of what it covers under the Local Health System Integration Act. LICIA defines integration, and it calls for each of the health service providers to be identifying integration opportunities. That's an obligation on all of you in terms of your focus and engagement with integration and health system renewal in the sector. In specific, LICIA says each LIN and each HSP shall separately and with each other identify opportunities to integrate services in the local health system to provide appropriate, coordinated, effective, and efficient services. And those are often the goals that drive integration initiatives. So within that definition, we see that they talk about the integration of services of the local health system. And the Act also then defines what does it mean by a service. And it's important to keep in mind that the concept of service for the purposes of considering integration is quite broad and goes beyond services or programs that are provided directly to individuals in the community. It includes also services that support such a service or program, or a function that supports the operation of a person or entity providing the service. So what does that mean? In essence, that means that all aspects of your operations that support the delivery of your frontline services are part of what's captured within the concept of a service for the purpose of looking for integration opportunities. So what do we mean then by integration opportunities? What does it mean to integrate? So while the term service under the legislation has a very broad definition, the term integrate also has a very broad definition and includes coordination of services and interactions, partnering to provide services or in operating, transferring, merging, or amalgamating, starting or ceasing to provide service, or ceasing to operate, dissolve, or wind up. So really a very broad spectrum that captures what it means to integrate. So from that, we take that integration can take many forms. Operational integration, which is service coordination or the pursuit of joint initiatives, would be examples of operational level integration. Management level integration, which for example is the consolidation of administrative back office functions, whether they be IT or finance, for example, or even shared management. This can be at the director level of programs to the level of senior leadership and officers, and in many cases, the joint use of executive directors or CEOs between organizations. It includes governance integration, which is the use of structures and constructs such as the joint board, where independent boards meet together as a single group, as well as the constitution of a variety of joint committees, from joint executive committees to other standing committees of the boards. And it includes corporate integration, which is the full merger of legal entities into one legal entity. There are different legal means through which that can be accomplished, but ultimately in the end, it's the combination of organizations into a single delivery vehicle. These fall along somewhat of a continuum, and I place them on a continuum not to say that, necessarily you will move through all of these stages. There may be many of you who are engaged in operational level integration, but have no intention or current planning in the longer term to be looking at a governance or corporate integration. But for those that are engaged in more corporate level integration, the notion of the continuum is one to keep in mind, because we will often see the growth towards corporate integration by the stepping through these stages along the continuum. So for example, it may begin by having at the program level integration and involvement between organizations for coordinated operation and service delivery. Over time, that may morph to having shared management structures between organizations, which then can evolve into having a shared governance approach to the organizations. And once organizations are comfortable about their synergy, then moving into full corporate integration into a single entity. It doesn't necessarily have to proceed in that fashion, but one can see that there is that spectrum and a bit of a stepping stone in terms of the scope and approach and types of integration that are engaged in across the spectrum. So we've talked about what is integration, what it includes, and what the spectrum of integration looks like. So who then are the organizations that are involved? Who are the stakeholders in integration initiatives? And we have a very broad audience joining us today for this coffee talk session. And so I've highlighted here a variety of funding sources that some of which may or may not apply to you individually as an HSP. But the point from this slide really is that the funder is a key stakeholder in integration activity. And each funder will set the terms of its funding and performance expectations. The role of the funder will play out differently depending on where you are in the integration spectrum. And for the purpose of today's discussion, we're talking about regional integration and the lead agency. And most often, that is at the operational end of the spectrum, where you're engaged in the coordination of delivery and service and operation with the election of an organization who will function as the lead. And so as we move forward with our discussion about stakeholders and models, that is the area of the spectrum that we're going to be focused on. And I won't be touching within the time that we have today the role that stakeholders and others play or models that would apply in the management, governance, or corporate end of the integration spectrum. So from an operational integration perspective around service integration, the focus and the role of the funder as a stakeholder is in terms of the funding that they provide, what they provide, who they provide it to, and what terms and conditions are then attached to that funding, including the performance expectations and accountability for those performance expectations. The lead or host agency is another key stakeholder in service integration. And the term lead agency itself is not a defined term. It's a term that we use frequently in the sector, but there is in fact no legal meaning that's attached to the term of lead agency. And what the role and responsibility of a lead agency is will differ by the nature of the initiative and the funder or group of organizations that are involved in the respective integration activity at the operational level. And so it's important to recognize that the role of the lead may exist in these service integration initiatives, but it's important to unpack what that means for each initiative because it can look quite different. Similarly, the role of the participant or service provider, and we'll see in a minute as I get into the models why I've used the two different phrases of participant and service provider. The role of the participant and service provider can also look quite different depending on their relationship with the lead organization. What is key to remember from a service provider perspective is that ultimately, regardless of the model, you are always responsible for your own organization in the implementation and delivery of your services. So we've talked about the integration spectrum and that our focus today is on the lead agency in regional integration, which is really the operational end of the spectrum. We've looked at who the stakeholders are in that operational integration, being the funder, the lead agency, and the participant or service provider. And now what I would like to spend some time on is looking at what are the legal models for implementing service integration. And there are some different legal models. There are various forms of models of relationships that are implemented across the province for these regional integration initiatives that imbue a role of a lead agency. I'm going to talk about two of the most prevalent today, which are the association model and the service provider model. The legal relationship is often structured around the flow of funding and accountability. And the selection of which legal model of relationship is appropriate in the circumstances will often be driven in the first instance around how the funding relationship has been established. So it is that funding relationship that's going to drive your decision making on the appropriate model to be implemented for your service integration initiative. So the first model that I'd like to spend a little time on is the association model. In an association model, each organization receives direct funding from the funder for its services. That's crucially important because each HSP is receiving, or organization, is receiving its funding and has a direct relationship with the funder. That will contrast from the service provider model that we'll talk about in a minute. In an association model, the organizations that are involved will then associate with each other or collaborate with each other. And the means through which they do that is an association or collaboration agreement. There's no magic to the name. You can call it whatever you like, but in essence, it is through that agreement that they come together to agree to coordinate in terms of their service delivery and or harmonization and standardization of practices and procedures related to service delivery. Generally, in an association or a collaboration model, there will be some form of a decision-making body. How much decision-making authority is accorded to that decision-making body will differ depending on the nature of the initiative. But there will most often be at least some form of a steering committee, a collaboration committee, executive committee. Again, there's no magic in the name, and you can call it whatever you like, but the essence of it is that it is a committee that is jointly constituted from the organizations that are involved and the means through which they engage in either decision-making or identification of recommendations for adoption by the group. In these circumstances, where does a lead agency come from? The lead agency sometimes is appointed directly by the funder, and the funder may determine, well, this is a model where we're funding each organization separately, but we want this certain organization take on the role of lead agency, and it will, in those circumstances, imbue that lead agency with certain responsibilities. That's not always the case, and there are other association models in the province where the group itself has come together to identify and appoint from among themselves one organization who will serve in the lead role. So in an association model, what does the lead agency do? They will often act as a liaison with the funders. They will sometimes be asked to provide forms of regional reporting for these regional integration initiatives. They may engage in certain central functions for the group as a whole, and they could potentially be given a role and responsibility in leading negotiation and even potentially entering into contracts with third parties on behalf of the group. So an example of that would be in the context of pursuit of IT or software initiatives through an association or collaboration, where you may be negotiating hosting or software licensing or other arrangements with third parties. In the role of an association with the lead, the funder may in fact provide a separate stream of funding to the lead organization to provide or engage in certain consolidated administrative or support functions. So for example, a funder may provide funding for a service planning coordinator, which is a role that is for the group and the delivery of the services through the group, through that coordination, but they will fund that position through the lead, who will then be the employer of record for that service planning coordinator. So that's just, one example of the types of discrete lead funding that may be received by a lead in the context of an association model. So as we talked about earlier, how does one set up an association or collaboration of this nature? It's essentially done by contract through an agreement called an association, collaboration agreement, whatever label you would like to place on it. And there are key components, no matter what you call the agreement, that would be contained within a contract establishing such a collaboration or association for the purpose of service integration. That contract should set out the scope and authority of the lead agency. It should define the obligations of the participants in the collaboration or coordination of the service or other initiative that may be the subject of the agreement. Importantly, the agreement will allocate risk among the participant group, and as well, although not noted on the slide here, in respect of the role of the lead agency as well. That document will outline the governance framework. And this is a small g governance framework because remember here, each organization is still standing on their own feet and has their big G governance. So this governance framework is really the how is the group working together to engage in integration, and what is the role of the lead in facilitating that collective dialogue in having that integration. And it may define whether there will be any decision making taken by the group and how that decision making will be undertaken, and if there are disputes among the group in terms of the implementation or engagement of specific participants or the initiative generally, it will set out a process for dispute resolution between the parties. Critically important anytime you're entering into any integration initiative is to be thinking about, well, what if other participants wish to join? And what if you as a participant wish to withdraw from the initiative or to terminate other participants for their failure to abide by their commitments to the initiative? There's always a lot of positive momentum in entering into these integration initiatives, and keeping in mind the exit options is really something that serves everyone well, because while there are the best of intentions for all involved going forward with an initiative, you want to be able to ensure from a risk management perspective that in the event that it doesn't materialize in the manner that you are expecting, or the involvement of your partners doesn't materialize in the manner that that you have required of them, that you have the authority and the ability to address those situations. So what are some challenges? Integration is something that everyone is very focused on, in especially at the operational level across the province. But it does mark change. It's system renewal, it's system change. And with all changes come some challenges. And so what are the challenges that are involved with having an association model? When you bring together a group in this manner, where each have individual responsibilities, big G governance for their own organization, a key challenge of these models, of an association model, is balancing the decision-making and work of the collaboration or association or group of organizations intending to integrate and coordinate with each other without compromising the autonomy and the best interests of your organization at an organizational level. And sometimes that can cause a real tension between what is the will of the group in moving an initiative forward and what may not meet interests of your organization specifically. Allocating legal and financial risk is often one, especially in the larger collaboration initiatives that involve organizations across the care continuum that are of different size and different ability in terms of being able to bear legal and financial risk. Where we have small organizations and large organizations, this whole discussion around how legal and financial risk will be allocated, what are the appropriate formula for allocating that legal and financial risk, is often a matter of discussion, and a very important one that needs to be grappled with in entering into these initiatives. And addressing participant non-compliance. In these types of integration initiatives, the goal is to have everyone at the table engaged and involved, and there's a certain level of honor that is expected from those that are at the table, that they're going to honor their commitments, that they're going to honor the decisions that are made, that they're going to implement the standards and principles that the group is collectively deriving and developing. Where you have an organization that is non-compliant, that often becomes a challenge because you want to have them part of the discussion. The coordination across the continuum is important in terms of having the right participants across the continuum at the table in order to be fully effective. But at the same time, you have to grapple with what does that mean for the legal, financial, quality, service risk that's created where you have a participant at the table who is unwilling or non-compliant. So that is the association model. And in stark contrast to the association model, we have at the operational integration level what is actually becoming a very common model across the province is the service provider model. This is now widely used, and this is where a lead agency receives all of the funding for administration and service delivery from the funder and is fully accountable to the funder in respect of the use of the funds and the delivery of the services, together with any performance metrics or terms and conditions that have been attached to the funding and the service. So the lead in this situation carries a lot of accountability and responsibility on its shoulders. The service provider is not directly accountable to the funder. And where the service provider's accountability will be established will be in its relationship between lead and service provider. In a service provider model, the lead contracts with each service provider as a service delivery agent. The service providers are providing the service on behalf of the lead as its agent, with the lead ultimately responsible and accountable, and I'll say, in quotes with a small o, owner of the service from a funding and accountability perspective. And through that contract, the lead will have the provider deliver certain services as its agent and flow through to that provider all of the performance metrics, terms, and conditions that have been placed on the lead by the funder to the service provider from the perspective of ensuring that all of those requirements are met and performance metrics satisfied in the service delivery for which the lead agency is ultimately accountable. There are different ways that the service provider model can be structured financially, and we've seen both in the province, a transfer payment system or a unit cost approach. And the unit cost has become the more prevalent over time, but there still are initiatives that come across my desk from time to time that still have this transfer payment modality. And so I want to still take a few minutes to talk about that today so that you're fully aware of what the difference is between the two models and better able to recognize the difference when it's before you. This service provider model, from the perspective of the lead agency, is a much less complex arrangement because it places the authority, control within and accountability within squarely within the responsibility of the lead agency. And so the lead agency is then able to implement unfettered what the model should look like in satisfying its obligations to the funder. So what is a transfer payment? I want to take a minute and just distinguish transfer payment funding from unit cost funding under a service provider model for service providers. So transfer payment means that there is a lump sum funding that is provided at certain intervals that is to be managed on an agreed upon budget. So this is where there's a flow through of a pocket of dollars to the service provider, and you say, service provider, I'm giving you this pocket of dollars, and with that pocket of dollars, you are expected to do the following things. And often it will flow through, or should flow through, the balanced budget or other requirements around the use of the funds that have been identified by the funder. It must importantly include some audit rights for the lead because you've now handed over a full pocket of funding, and you need to be able to have oversight over how those funds are in fact used. Not because you don't trust the service provider, that the other providers will be honorable in terms of the use of those funds, but because legally, as lead, you are accountable to the funder in respect of the use of those funds and will be called to task to answer in respect of the use. So likewise, funders will often hold for themselves in this type of transfer payment model the ability to recoup unused funds and funds that have not been appropriately used. And so likewise, you need to have the ability for the lead, even if they flow through a transfer payment to a provider, to have the ability to recoup those funds for the same reasons in order for the lead to then be able to return the funds to the funder when demanded. In contrast, and often the model of choice, is the unit cost model. In a unit cost model, it's essentially payment for services rendered. And it typically includes a service fee that is attributed to the service that is being contracted from the lead, by the lead from the service provider. It will include an invoice and payment mechanism for the services provided. And it will have the service provider in this model responsible for their own administration. So it's up to the provider to take the fees that they receive for services rendered and then to engage in their own internal budgeting that is completely outside the purview of the lead in terms of how they use those funds and what they use them for in the operation of their organization. So what are some common challenges with moving to a service provider model? This one can often be difficult in instituting system renewal and change, because while organizations accept that regionalization is occurring in this fashion, what it results in is a loss of autonomy for those service providers who are now contracted providers of the lead, where previously they had their own direct relationship with the funder in respect of the services that they were rendering. So ensuring that you have measures in place to still be able to engage in some form of input, collaboration, collective space for discussion and dialogue will assist in being able to address some of that resistance in the loss of autonomy. What will be important as lead, and often also a challenge, however, is balancing the authority that the lead must have by virtue of this model because of its accountability to the funder, with the desire to have that more collaborative approach where organizations are working collectively together in improving the coordination and delivery of care. And in the event that you are using a transfer payment model, an important challenge is the ability to control and repatriate funds that are flowed through to budgets of the service provider. And there need to be means, measures, and terms put in place in order to ensure that as a lead agency, you are not then financially or legally exposed. So regardless of the model that you choose in engaging in regional integration through service integration at the operational level, if you are a lead agency or you are a participant organization, you have an interest from both circumstances to ensure that there's appropriate risk management in the manner that things are being implemented to protect each organization that is involved. And so at the first level, you'll want to engage in internal and external due diligence. From an internal due diligence perspective, it's determining, especially if you're going to be taking on the role of lead, do you have the infrastructure and ability to be able to engage in the role of lead and assume that level of responsibility? And for external due diligence, looking at who are the organizations that you're engaging with, be that at a collaborative level or a service provider level. What is their reputation in terms of engaging and following through with their commitments, the quality of the services that they render, any legal history that they may have. And for all models, lead agency models that you're implementing, you want to ensure that you have contracts and legal structures that are in place. And they don't need to be, pages and pages of legal documents, but you want them to cover certain key concepts in order to ensure that you have appropriately protected your organization from a risk management perspective in engaging in these transformation and renewal initiatives. So what are those key things that you should look for? Defining the funding flow. How is the funding moving? Who receives it? What terms are attached to it? And who's accountable for it? Providing clarity on the roles, responsibility, and accountability of each organization that's involved. Allocating risk and liability between organizations in a manner that is clear and enforceable by the parties. And I stress enforceable because it's not uncommon when engaging in service level integration at a regional perspective to see the use of documents like a memorandum of understanding or MOU. And those documents, unless prescribed to be binding, are sometimes not written as binding documents. And you want to ensure that you do have, for all organizations involved, a clear risk and liability allocation that each party can enforce on if needed. You want to ensure and look for the establishment of certain service standards, because as you are engaged either in a collaborative fashion or through a service provider model in the delivery of service, you want a level of standardization and quality assurance in terms of the services that are being delivered. And to the extent that it's applicable, the decision-making protocol. How are decisions being made and communicated, regardless of the model with which you are engaged? I'll park as we wrap up here at the end for a minute on some of the stepping stone documents before one reaches a full service provider contract or a full collaboration agreement. These initiatives grow over time and often begin with expressions of interest by the parties that are at the table and a desire to bring to your respective governors or to demonstrate to your funders that you have a mutual commitment to pursue regional integration in that fashion. And that can often be documented through early agreements that I call stepping stone documents, like the Memorandum of Understanding, the Letter of Intent is sometimes called, or even an interim agreement where it's circumstances that we're of course all familiar with, where the paper sometimes needs to catch up with the nature of coordination or service that's happening on the ground. And so an interim agreement can sometimes provide a Band-Aid cover while the more fulsome documents are being delivered. These documents, each one of them in their own way, enables the relationship to commence while you're working on the definitive agreements, while you're getting them, put through your appropriate internal approval processes and ultimately executing and delivering them. And in each circumstance, you need to consider the stage of the integration initiative to be able to ensure that where you have commitments that you intend to be binding, that you're using a form of document and clearly that is appropriate for that, and clearly articulating that desire for certain commitments at that early stage to be binding. An example of that is even if you're at a memorandum of understanding or letter of intent stage where it hasn't been fully decided that you're going to pursue the initiative, but you are exploring the potential of pursuing the initiative, there may be exchange of confidential information between the organizations in order to enable that dialogue and assessment to occur, and the exchange of due diligence information and assessing each other as organizations that you want to engage with in the initiative. And you would want to ensure that there is a binding commitment from a confidentiality and privacy perspective on the use and access to that type of information. So that's just one example of a binding term that you may wish to seek. So we've covered a lot of material in our time together today. We started by talking about integration because our topic today was regional integration and the lead agency. And so we started by examining, well, what do we actually mean by regional integration and the lead agency? And we covered that there is in fact quite a broad spectrum of integration. And when we're talking about the role of a lead agency, we're really talking about one end of that integration spectrum, more around the service and operational integration. There are various legal models of service integration, and the key principle that we discussed was that which model is appropriate in the circumstances is going to follow and flow from the funding and accountability relationships with the funder. What the role of the lead agency is going to differ depending on the model that is being implemented. And regardless of which model you select, it is important to recognize that there may be potential challenges with the implementation of the model. And in order to ensure that you can appropriately address those challenges, you want to be taking a risk-managed approach to the way that you are implementing your integration initiatives. So with that, with our time remaining, I'm happy to open to questions. This one is locked.
There's no questions so far.
There's no questions so far. What's our time check?
At 8:41.
So we have about 20 minutes left. If there are questions, I'm being told that there are no questions registered in the chat box at this time. In this new modality, I'm unfortunately not able to, as we did before, have conversations with you on your questions. But if there are discrete questions you'd like me to talk about, by all means, we can use the time, and please do submit them in the chat box. I'll give a few minutes for that before I move to a wrap up. I'm not seeing any questions come through at this time, which is fine. And so instead of keeping everyone waiting, I'll invite you to contact me directly. If you have any questions, my information is on the slide. Most of you know where to find me already anyways. So thank you very much for participating in our Coffee Talk session today on regional integration. If there is any additional information that you require, you're always welcome to contact us, and we would welcome you completing our survey so that we can receive feedback on the session, as well as input for any future topics that you would like any member of our team to talk about in our health industry seminar series curriculum going forward. This does bring us to the end of the curriculum for our spring session, and we will take a bit of a break for the summer and be back in September, and there will be a curriculum that will be circulated shortly for the fall session. So get your requests in. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.